Today in the EU, has the EU underestimated its relationship with Gulf countries? EU and Gulf leaders will meet on Wednesday, 16th of October in Brussels, in a first-ever summit between the two regions. Co-chaired by outgoing European Council President Charles Michel and Qatar's Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, the meeting is an opportunity to strengthen relations following the launch of their strategic partnership in 2022. As the Gulf global influence grows and its role as a key energy partner for the EU expands, particularly in light of the EU's energy independence from Russia, which remains a significant ally for Gulf countries, the concerns within the EU about this fact are rising. Conversely, Gulf countries are concerned about the EU's inconsistent stance on Gaza, so can both sides overcome these issues to reignite and deepen their diplomatic and energy partnership? Hello and welcome. I am Evi Kiorri, and this is Today in the EU. To answer this question, I spoke with Camille Lons, Policy Fellow at the European Council of Foreign Relations, and Cinzia Bianco, Visiting Fellow at the same think tank. Starting with you, Cinzia. It's the first time the EU and Gulf countries organize a joint summit. What are the primary objectives of this event?
So the main objective is to get some political backup for boosting a lot of different files where at the technical level and the policy level, the two sides have already started exploring opportunities for cooperation, and have found that there are a lot of things that can be done together and can be achieved together.
I'm very optimistic that this summit can be an important political moment because together with the Gulf countries and the European Union leaders, we want to upgrade at a more strategic level our relationship,
said European Council President Charles Michel.
The outcome of the summit to deepen strategic relations, and we can even say interdependence on several files, is to really accelerate on a bunch of initiatives that have been already launched in the past, including liberalized trade between the two sides, but also cooperating more on regional security, in particular soft security like maritime or counterterrorism, and then on regional security, basically finding some broader political alignment to push for what are already joint objectives: de-escalation and the general stability of the wider shared neighborhood.
Now, given the long-standing obstacles in the EU GCC trade talks, especially on issues on human rights, environmental standards and public procurement, how will the summit address these challenges to move forward with a potential free trade agreement?
So what the sides are now exploring actively is to have a much vaguer trade liberalization agreement between the European Union and the Gulf Cooperation Council, and more specific bilateral agreements between the European Union and individual GCC countries, where they can go more in depth and address some of these questions that have been blocking progress so far.
And Cinzia, could we say that the EU has been underestimating or neglecting the relationship with the Middle East and the Gulf countries when it comes to trade and collaborations?
Well, it's not only about trade. Actually, trade was always quite high on the agenda. The problem was that there were actual difficulties and technical difficulties, political challenges that were really difficult to overcome. But if you sort of zoom out, yes, we can definitely say that there was some neglect, and in particular, there was a different outlook, geopolitical outlook in the wider region, where the United States had a pretty exclusive relationship to these Gulf countries, and the Europeans were much more concerned with deepening relations with Mediterranean countries. So then, the regional equilibrium changed in favor of the Gulf countries. Also, the Europeans sort of understood that there were a lot of other possibilities in having deeper relations with the Gulf.
And with Gulf states maintaining complex relationships with China and Russia, how might the new EU leadership, particularly High Representative Kaja Kallas, influence EU GCC geopolitical dynamics, especially concerning the war in Ukraine and cooperation with Russia?
It definitely is going to be a challenge because there are different views on Russia and on China. The Gulf countries are already well into multipolarity, whereas the Europeans are aware that we are entering a multipolar world, but they still sort of don't recognize certainly Russia as a pole in itself that is worthy of overcoming and ignoring the aggression in Ukraine to build deeper relations with. So it's a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the new European Commission, and in particular the new High Representative Kaja Kallas, is definitely going to ramp up the messaging towards the Gulf countries on why it is not ultimately convenient to align with Russia on basically anything from energy to trade. Ultimately, Russia does not have much to offer to the Gulf countries, especially after a couple of years of sanctions. And as Europeans continue to support Ukraine in the coming future, it's always destined to become a weaker player, Russia.
And coming to you, Camille, how do you see GCC countries perceiving the change on EU leadership? And will this indeed change the direction of the geopolitical dynamics in this context?
That's indeed something that GCC countries are watching carefully because, first of all, there's a sense that Kaja Kallas is maybe a bit less interested in Middle Eastern issues than her predecessor, Josep Borrell, who was very active and is still quite vocal, especially in the context of the current crisis. Borrell immediately endorsed Saudi Arabia's call for a global coalition and a two-state solution in Palestine. This is something where we can expect the new high rep to be a bit less vocal. There's also a question of with the new commissioner for the Mediterranean, and now these countries are falling under that portfolio as well. It's a bit unclear who is going to be in charge of what and what that means exactly. Kaja Kallas is also known for being a bit more hawkish on relations with Russia and China. And again, this is something that is going to be watched carefully by GCC countries, given how important their relations with some of these big powers is. They've been trying to really find a balance in the context of great power competition between their relations with Western powers, including especially the US, and their relations with Russia, and I think even more importantly with China. And so this is, if the EU is moving towards a more hawkish position on China, this is going to reduce their margin of maneuver in trying to find the right balance between these different powers. There is definitely a very different reading on the EU side and the GCC side of, first of all, the war in Ukraine. The war in Gaza has not helped at all in that sense, especially on the narrative of European double standards. But there is the point that the EU can make to GCC countries also when it comes to Russia, that we see now a rapprochement between Russia and Iran, with Iran talking about sending some ballistic missiles to Russia, the fact that we have some reports about Russia supporting the Houthis in Yemen. And so this is also affecting directly GCC security interests. And so I think that the EU is going to try to make a point here that Russia is not a reliable partner for GCC countries, and that there might be an interest to have more alignment between EU and GCC positions. But I think we're quite so far from that now.
And what does today's summit say about the role of Gulf countries on the international geopolitical stage? For instance, Qatar has been key mediator in the Israel-Hamas negotiations. Is Europe looking at its Gulf counterparts as equal partners to resolve conflicts in the region?
That's the idea behind this whole strategic partnership that the EU launched with GCC countries. There is really a realization that they are emerging as key regional players, but also players on the international scene in this kind of context of the emergence of middle powers, the fact that a few of them have joined the BRICS Plus, that they have strong relations with Asian powers. And now the current conflict in the Middle East is even further reinforcing the importance of GCC countries. There is a sense that both on the EU side and on the GCC side, there has been a bit of a lack of leadership when trying to resolve that crisis. Both, the EU side is very divided. The GCC side has been very cautious in its approach to the crisis, despite trying to position itself, especially the Saudis, as key regional players. They have been very cautious in their response to the crisis. So it can be quite challenging to work with these countries, but there is a real sense that they are actually crucial players in what is happening today. The Saudi-Iranian diplomatic channel is key, I think, for Europeans to try to leverage and try to limit the risk of a wider regional escalation. There's been actually since the beginning of the crisis very active Saudi-Iranian diplomatic engagements. And I think this is something definitely that the EU side should try to leverage. Same thing as well, like the fact that Saudi Arabia has some sort of leverage towards Israel through the kind of normalization question. I mean, the Saudis have been clear that there would be no normalization with Israel without a Palestinian state, but this is a leverage as well, again, that can be used in trying to put pressure on Israel or at least incentivize it in a certain direction.
And Cinzia, how do the EU and GCC countries can work together to prevent further regional instability? And what role could Gulf countries play in mediating peace or containing these conflicts?
So the first thing we need to say is that both sides, the Europeans and the Gulf countries, they both share objectives in terms of restoring some form of regional stability. First, working on a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, then preventing the expansion of the conflict further into Lebanon and even a further escalation into Syria, direct confrontation between Israel and Iran. There is a shared analysis and awareness that we're risking a regional conflagration and an escalation beyond control.
There is a lot we can do together, and of course, in terms of geopolitical challenges, we need to cooperate, we need to coordinate the war in Gaza, the situation in the Middle East, the war launched by Russia against Ukraine. It requires more efforts.
Stressed Charles Michel.
And there is a shared willingness to stop that and dial down the tension. So it is very important to say that there is a common ground that they stand on. And also that this summit is not the first time that the two sides have actually talked about the different regional crises. In fact, they have a lot of opportunity for exchanges on the different dossiers, and they have found this broad alignment that we were talking about. Then, of course, when you look further deeper into it, you start to notice that there are some slight differences of perspectives, especially with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Some European member states have different views than other European member states even, and certainly different views than the Gulf countries. But even the Gulf countries themselves, they have slightly different takes and positions on this conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So it is about finding shared terrain for joint diplomatic initiatives. And the Europeans are now eager to involve the regional players into their own diplomatic efforts. So I think that's a good starting point to kind of do more work together.
And what collaboration opportunities does this summit present on energy and climate? Can Gulf countries be trusted partners in the green transition given their track record?
So this is one of the key elements that was highlighted in the EU GCC partnership. They have a key role to play, I think, in global energy transition. It's a role that is a bit controversial in Europe, obviously. The fact, for example, that the UAE hosted COP28 last year, it was also at the same time strongly criticized for using that platform to negotiate some of its own hydrocarbon deals on the margins, or it was accused of doing a greenwashing. There is obviously like an element of controversies and challenge, and these countries, for very simple reasons, I mean, their economies are still extremely reliant on hydrocarbon exports, and so their interests are not the same as the interests of European countries. But at the same time, they have also invested quite massively in green solutions, technologies, and so it would not be necessarily very smart not to take them into account and not to try to work with them. They have, for example, also a role to play in investing in some of the critical minerals in regions like Africa and Central Asia that are also going to be important for green technologies. And there is a sense of frustration also on the GCC side that the EU has been pushing them to invest quite a lot on, for example, hydrogen, green hydrogen, with the idea that maybe they could export hydrogen to the European market. So both countries are investing in hydrogen, but there is not clear demand on the EU side on hydrogen for the moment. So it's taking a bit of time to get there, but I think this is one of the elements where there is a real possibility for cooperation between the two sides.
So, what is there to say about human rights? There are mounting concerns over human rights breaches in the GCC countries. The building of the Qatar World Cup infrastructures being one of those examples that provoked a strong outrage across Europe. Could that hit the EU's reputation?
Human rights is one of the recurring issue when we talk about GCC EU relations. Every time there is a visit of a GCC diplomat or encountering including with the European Parliament, there are always a lot of questions on human rights issues, and that's something very important, obviously. But I think also there are some challenges around that issue, especially in the current context. The war in Gaza and the way European countries have been positioning themselves, being sometimes reluctant to call out Israel on its own breach of international law, has really damaged the kind of values-based foreign policy of the EU, and especially the way it is perceived in some of these GCC countries. It is very complicated at the moment for the Europeans to come to GCC countries and call them out on human rights and values when there is a sense that they have a very not a very consistent approach when defending those values when it touches some of their interests. And so Europeans have been damaging a lot their leverage on some of these questions. And this is something that they'll have to take into consideration when talking to GCC countries.
Thank you very much for the insights. I am Evi Kiorri, and this was Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. You can get in touch with us by leaving a comment or review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us a lot to spread the word about our work, but also understand what topics you like listening to. This episode was produced by Miriam Sainz Tejada, Charles Cohen, and me. Thank you for tuning in, and until tomorrow morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.